Okay. Yes.
Ναι. Εκτός αν... So we're all very pleased. I'll let my colleague Dionysius Christias say the honors, and we are for our particular guest. But we are very pleased that finally Lambridis Library has been renovated, thanks to the generous donation by the Lilian Voudouri Foundation. And this year's series of talks, this year's colloquium, has been taken over by Dionysius Christias, which will immediately present our first speaker. Sorry for a slight delay in getting started, but yeah. Okay.
Thank you. This year's seminar will have the general title Reason and Nature. So the talks for 2026 will be roughly about this subject from the standpoint of analytic philosophy, continental philosophy, or even from the standpoint of the history of ideas. So our first speaker today is Antonio Nunziante, professor at the University of Padova, professor of philosophy. He has written many articles on the philosophy of Leibniz, Kant, Hegel, and Sellars. And in the last few years, or more, I don't know, he's working on the issue of the American naturalists of the first half of the 20th century. So it's an issue that combines philosophy with the history of ideas. And today's talk is entitled by Antonio Nunziante, In the Name of Nature, on the Naturalization of History in American Philosophical Naturalism, which is a part, I think, of a book that is forthcoming about naturalism and civilization, I think, yes. So, Antonio.
Thank you, Dionysius. Thank you. You all. Is such a privilege, such an honor staying here in Athens in this wonderful location. And Lambridis is such a fascinating figure, so I'm really honored to be here, and I'll do my best not to waste your time. So I'm going to speak in plain words about contemporary topics, which is mainly focused on the intellectual USA history, but has a huge relevancies and implication also for the Atlantic relation and the so-called concept of the West, okay, the resemantization of the West. I have prepared some slides, so maybe we can follow. Maybe it's easier for all of us to follow the flow, yeah, of the speech. Okay. Okay, I want to start if you're able to. Yeah. Okay. Okay, I would take my first steps from speaking of history from the European model. So we are all acquainted with this model, but let's say that over the course of the 19th century, humanities, in a sense, are under attack because of the increasing success of positivism, natural sciences, applied sciences, but also technology and the rise of evolutionary theories, the expansion of the industrial economic model, social transformation, and so on. And maybe you remember now this intellectual philosophical movement labeled as the German historicism, okay, which figure like Dilthey or Windelband, or yeah, they nicely distinguish between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften. And the rationale behind this distinction was to overcome a certain hierarchization of sciences. Okay, so the main threat was to absorb the Geisteswissenschaften within the Naturwissenschaften. And so maybe you remember the rationale of the argument, for instance, of Dilthey. Dilthey pointed out that the relation that we humans entertain with historical events is different than the relation we entertain to natural objects. Because in a sense, we perceive natural historical events as ours, as our product. We made them, whereas we didn't make nature or natural objects. So the relation is different. So basically, the idea was to figure out different level of the scientific discourse. So scientific discourse can be, in the words of Windelband, nomothetic or ideographic. So nomothetical sciences now are aimed to find out some generalities, general laws, something of the light, and they move in the domain of the erklären, to explain, to show the causal empirical connection. Whereas the Geisteswissenschaften, for instance, history, they are ideographic science. It's so nice being here in Greece, I don't have to explain the etymology of the words, okay? So if you want to understand why the myth of the raven in the North USA differs from region to region, we cannot but do history to enter into the particular development of the tribe, a community, and so on. So the Geisteswissenschaften are aimed at comprehension, verstehen, okay? So towards the end of the 19th century in Europe, such a distinction is huge, is accepted between nature and culture, okay? It has also to do with the topic of values, for instance, no? So nature is values free in the words of Rickert, for instance, whereas natural sciences are bound with values, okay? And history becomes a sort of cornerstone of resistance because of his epistemic scientific status, okay? Now, if we are shift on the other side of the Atlantic toward the end of the 19th century, we face a completely different situation. Society is different. Of course, the process of secularization is slower than in Europe, whereas on the contrary, the process of modernization is unbelievably speed. And then, of course, comes Darwin, okay, 1859, first edition in Europe, 1860 in USA. I want us to be focused on the fact that the reception of the Darwinian theories were completely different in Europe and in USA. 1860, it was a time of a civil war. The intellectual debate was heated by racial theories, the fact of the slavery. Also this, how can I say, religious divide. There were the more progressist area of the Unitarian Church who accepted the Darwinian model and this idea that God reveals itself in the name of science and not by accepting dogma, tradition, and so on. So when we speak prima facie of naturalization of history, we intend the idea of interpreting history, human history, as part of a larger natural history, okay? So the very distinction between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften doesn't hold really in the USA, with a notable exception of the anthropological school, namely by Franz Boas, okay? But he was German, he was trained in Germany, and so he kept with him this distinction, but it was an exception. All in all, we hadn't this distinction, but the main idea was to treat culture as a natural process, as a natural event. Okay, so culture becomes part of a natural history. And first of all, one of the main tenets of naturalism, of course, is that we don't have a higher plan in history. If we have in mind the distinction put by Leibniz, for instance, between the realm of grace or the realm of nature, we have no such a distinction. There is no plan in history, no final destination. And how can I say, human and political order is not the mirror of a divine supernatural order. What really matters are empirical space-time determinable causal relations, environmental correlation, and yes, back in the days, around the end of the 19th century, history wasn't really a big thing in the USA because the attention was focused on the future, not on the past. So we had a few historians, and history was considered as a sort of literary discipline, with this idea now that history is made by the hero, the great heroes. No? Here, on the contrary, the narrative changes completely. So the attention must be focused not so much on individuals, but on processes, on causal relations. As a matter of fact, within a few decades, at the beginning of the 20th century, the discipline history, from an institutional point of view, shifted into the domain of social sciences. Okay, and there stay for up to now. So history had to be reshaped in the name of these evolutionary models. Okay. And the naturalization of history had also to accomplish a sort of civic mission, because over the long course of the time, we witness the achievement of political, civil liberties. And so this should represent a social, but also an evolutionary account, in the sense that over the long run, human community tend toward freedom, okay? And that was particularly important in the USA, this narrative centered on freedom, of course, because naturalized history should lay the foundation for a shared national identity. Remember now the Civil War, because freedom constitute, that was the main reading, an historical event, combined with the topic of the American exceptionalism, of course, but an historical situated event which had a universal significance. Okay, so history had to accomplish both these tasks, scientific and civic, let's say. Okay, when we speak about naturalism as a major movement that gained its traction among the end of the 19th century and gained its momentum over the first decades of the 20th century, reaching its peak during the 40s, broadly speaking, we are referring to a philosophical, intellectual, cultural movement which aimed to provide a biological / evolutionary account of the development of human communities, of the development of social processes. So understanding the normativity implying social processes according to an evolutionary account, okay? Including all cultural manifestation, art, religion, philosophy included. So the basic idea is that you could use whatever model you wanted, but at a certain point, you should be able to show a certain degree of integration with the biological account. This is the main tenet of naturalism. Okay, up to a certain degree, you have to show that your theoretical model is capable of integration with a biological account of it. Okay, this is the broadest definition of naturalism. I was saying that during the 40s, it came to its peak. Here, the date were not accidental. Naturalism and the human spirit was the great manifesto of the American naturalism. And yeah, 1944, the game in Europe are over, basically. We are now in the middle of the most serious political, military crisis and cultural crisis. And here in this miscellaneous volume, we find such an idea. For instance, this idea, which sounds easy, but it's not easy at all, that cultural development and natural evolution, in a sense, do overlap. Okay. Moreover, the cultural development, natural evolution, scientific development are overlapping processes. Okay. Not everybody did agree on this. For instance, the anthropological school, Franz Boas, I was referring to, they kept distinct cultural processes, cultural development, and natural evolution. Okay, but there was tension on it. And so we have this idea, general idea that which is powerful from a rhetorical point of view, that empirical sciences are, in a sense, the outcome of an evolutionary process. So over the long term, over the long run of history, the best scientific practices have been selected, okay? And that's why the methodological principles were regarded as universally applicable. Not so much the content of science, but the method. That was the real goal, okay? And so that's why also speaking to the intellectual USA debate, the very distinction between Geisteswissenschaften and Naturwissenschaften lose its grip. Okay, consider the title, Naturalist and the Human Spirit. No, the human spirit. The word Geist had to be treated.
Someone has his microphone on.
You can mute everybody. You can mute. You can mute.
Και αν μπορείς να με κάνεις co-host.
Όλοι mute είναι.
Όλοι mute είναι. Τότε μιλάς εσύ.
Πώς είναι το host, πώς είναι.
Okay, so yes, so back to our slides. The distinction, I would say, between natural sciences and human sciences lost its significance, its pregnancies, basically. But it was much more than this because there was now this idea that in a naturalized, let's say scientific, let's say evolution, let's say natural account of history, well, human beings become aware of their own history. Empirically, under empirical and scientific point of view. So the main features of a naturalized history, we can say, just to sum up, naturalized history is, to put it in contemporary terms, is strongly presentist. Because there was the idea now that the historian, he or she cannot but use his contemporary conceptual tool to analyze the past, okay? And not just only that, but our present interests that, so to say, drive the gaze of the historian to look into the past. It's normative because it's scientific discourse that provide historians proper conceptual filters. It's a secular narrative in the sense that we cannot refer to any supernatural plan. Okay, there is no divine order, a realm of grace, and so on. It's data-driven, it's focused on causal relation, process-oriented, and the last point that I put in bracket, there's a sort of teleological flavor, which shouldn't supposed to be, okay, in a sense. But this is the point on which I'd like to be focused. Yeah, precisely the last point. So, on the one side, the general premise is that we do not have a grand plan unfolding in the grand scheme of things, okay? So we don't have a plan. So human history is part of a broader natural history that is intrinsically devoid of purpose. No distinction between realm of nature, realm of grace, and no supernatural factors in action. Then I just open a bracket. It's particularly interesting to analyze the very concept of supernatural because it's plenty of problems, interesting stuff, but I close the bracket and I go on. But the point is this one. So, in a sense, we humans, we have a strong sense of purposiveness, trying to situate ourselves within nature, within the cosmos, within the past. And so naturalists quite early discussed this specific topic, how to combine this Darwinian anti-teleologies with an idea of a meaning, the idea that maybe there is a purpose in history, how we can combine such contradictory factors. Bear in mind that here we are speaking of something extremely serious, not only from a theoretical point of view. Here, this is Conius Reed, he's an historian, we are in 1950, this is a presidential speech, okay, kept in front of the American Historical Association. And Reed says, well, you know, guys, if historians, in their examination of the past, represent the evolution of civilization as haphazard, without direction, without progress, offering no assurance that mankind's present position is on the highway and not on some dead end, then mankind will seek for assurance in a more positive alternative, whether it would be offered from Rome or from Moscow. Naturalism has never meant to be just a philosophical position. It's a cultural position. Up to the 40s becomes something which involved the very idea of Western civilization. So now here the topic is, okay, be aware of just saying that there are no purposes in history. Because in a sense, humankind need an assurance, so to know. So to say, when we're speaking of Moscow, this is Gottschalk, 1946. Well, also in Russia, there was a form of naturalism, of course. And also a serious form of naturalism. The Russian example may be cited as a clear instance to the contrary. The naturalistic doctrine of Lenin was almost pure reductive materialism, with mind as a mere reflector of material processes, so pure materialism, okay, no God, no supernatural entities, but this doctrine was combined with an activist theory of history, according to which man, human being, is not primarily a slightly higher ape, adjusting himself to his immediate particular environment, but the spearhead of history, capable of extending the inexorable dialectic of cosmic process by virtue of his consciousness of the basic plan of history. This is the alternative. And so we don't want this alternative, but somehow we have to manage this topic of the telos of history. That we don't have telos in history. But on the other side, we want to stick to science. And we cannot but be Darwinian to accept the evolutionary model. So that was the theoretical issue. Now, I want to do my case studies, of course, because of time. I don't want to stay, to oblige to stay here for the next 12 hours. Just to this couple of leading figures. The first one is Frederick J. Woodbridge, and the other one is John Herman Randall Jr. They're both naturalists, both from, they were both active in New York, in the Columbia. They were both Aristotelian. They set the standard for a naturalistic interpretation of Aristotle in the USA for the decades to come. They both covered high institutional position. Woodbridge was dean for decades of the faculties of political science philosophy at Columbia. They were engaged in important editorial activity and so on and so on. And so I would refer to some of them in their writings, 1916, The Purpose of History. I just keep these two guys as case studies, but it's plenty of monography books, articles entitled The Purpose of History, The Purpose, the Meaning, in those days. For the economy of my talk, I would try to reconstruct the argument advanced by Woodbridge, inserting now and then some consideration from Randall Jr., okay, just for the sake of clarity. But so these two are the my main references, but of course they were part of a huge intellectual philosophical debate. Okay, so let's start with Woodbridge. Let's try to reconstruct his argument. So the topic now is if there is an end, a purpose in history. Major premise, there is discoverable in history no purpose. If we mean by purpose some future event towards which the whole creation is a funny word, okay, moves, and which past and present events portend. But the sense is clear, okay? So we do not have a general end. What we have is an ongoing, continuous process of natural evolution. What we have is that we don't even have history decline in singular term. We have a lot of histories. Okay, so we are not even allowed to speak of history, but of histories in the plural. Yet we are allowed to say that we are all part of a single unified physical system. This is a really important assumption because it drives to the assumption of an historical sameness, so a line of continuity between past and present. Okay. So we don't have purpose. Okay. There is discovered in history no purpose. The quotation go on. But there is purpose in history if we mean that the past is utilized as material for the progressive realization, at least by human beings, or what we call spiritual ends. More generally, history is itself essentially the utilization of the past for ends not necessarily foreseen, but ends to come, so that every historical thing, when we view it retrospectively, has the appearance of a result which has been selected, and to which its antecedents are exclusively appropriate. So look at language. So we do have, in a certain sense, purpose in history. And we also do have what we can call spiritual ends. No? So here the attempt is to preserve, okay, this idea instrumentally, because human beings, they use environmental resources, also coming from the past, for developing some projects and so on. So when we look backwards, we try to figure it out that we our society, and so on, is a sort of a result which has been a sort of a selective, result of coming from the past. The strategy of Woodbridge is to intertwine biology and history, in the sense of considering history or biology, as you prefer, as the counterpart of the other side. So on the one hand, we have no ends in nature, no basic plan, no designer, so on. But we have ends in human practices, in our action, our behavior. Why do we have ends in our social practices, individual practices? Well, all in all, because we are biological organisms. So such tendency to plan, to project, to accomplish some result, using different tools, using different means, is somehow rooted in our biological nature. So this is attempt. Human beings have a sense of purposiveness. Why then? Why then? Well, we are natural substances, natural individuals, natural organisms. So if we do have such sense of purposiveness, this should be rooted, it has to be rooted in our natural disposition. Okay? And then we can now combine these evolutionary conceptual resources, because in a sense, by adjusting to environment, in the long course of time, human beings design themselves, transform themselves, adapt themselves. Okay, so now the lexicon now comes from the evolutionary models and design themselves. Okay. Then we need to refer to another major assumption, which sounds maybe trivial, but it has its own importance. For Woodbridge, we have to acknowledge that historical events are different from historical description. So basically, on one side, we have representational tools, representational facts. On the other side, we have events, real events. Okay, so we have this sort of dichotomy between representation and events. And here science comes into the field, because in an ideal world, the adoption of scientifically informed filters helps the historian to minimize the gap between the interpretation, the representation, and the real facts. Okay, so using science, or science itself, is an sort of antidote against an hyper-representationalism. But just to keep a grip on reality. And here Kant comes into the stage, because what Woodbridge is trying to do is to construct a realistic position about purposiveness. Okay, what you want to do is to say that our idea of the fact that history has a purpose is not just a fantasy, but in a sense is rooted in the nature of things. This is his mental scheme, okay? Why Kant helps? You remember the argument of Kant in the third critique, in the Critique of Judgment. He was also discussing about the topic of teleology in nature within a transcendental system. And the argument was, okay, I cannot really say that we have finality in nature. I cannot say it, okay? But we cannot but represent nature as finalistically organized. That was the strategy, the master strategy of Kant. So now, during the transcendental perspective, we cannot say how things in themselves are, okay? So I cannot say that there is a finality in nature, but I cannot avoid of representing nature as if it's finalistically organized. Simple, elegant, and precise. And Woodbridge follow Kant's footsteps. There are no ends in history. I cannot say that there are plans in history. It is prohibited by Darwin, but I cannot but represent historical facts, assuming that they are teleologically organized. So this is the analogy, okay? I don't know whether there is a finality in nature, but due to the transcendental constitution of the subjectivity, I cannot help but represent history as it is teleologically organized. This is the analogy. So Kant helps to reinforce this idea that we are allowed to speak of ends in histories, okay? But there is more than that, because we, in a sense, we want to do something more than Kant. We want to go beyond the transcendental position. We want to construct a physical realist position. Consider that naturalism was also a movement that gained its momentum against the debate on idealism / religious / metaphysical system in the USA back in the 19th century. So the idea of realism is that we have things that are independent of our representation of them. So there are things out there which are independent of our mode, of our way of representing them. This is a sort of precondition of the naturalistic discourse, okay? So, and we precisely, remember when we, just before we were saying that there is no history, singular, there are histories, but we are all part of a single natural process system, okay? Here comes now the cache of the argument. We do know by science that nature is an evolving physical system in which we have no ends, but we have a principle of organization, of course. And such statement, Kant wouldn't agree on this. Of course, Kant wouldn't agree. But here the point is getting beyond Kant, because science, empirical science, tells us that nature is an evolving physical system, dot. No end, but organization. Here Aristotle comes to hold in the air, of course. And so historical description, back to Kant, deploy a system of telic organization, which in a way mirrors the normative structure of natural world. Here is how the argument is constructed. So we cannot represent history but having ends, purposes, okay? And such a representation mirrors the fact that there is a nomological layer in natural world, okay? Such mirroring is itself part of our biological nature. That's the point. We do not it by chance. We do it because of our natural disposition, because we are natural organisms rooted in a natural world. Here, maybe let's make Randall Jr. come into the stage. Here we have some other major assumption of the naturalist discourse, sort of framework, just to have more framework, okay? First assumption, the world is by nature intelligible and valuable, which is a strong commitment. is not at all easy, but it's pivotal at the same time. Why is by nature intelligible? It must be, otherwise we wouldn't have science. But we do have a science. We are able of operating predictions. We are able of enucleating general laws and models. Okay? Thinking, valuing, evaluating are in themselves natural events. More, the very search for intelligibility itself has a natural setting. Now you can see every brick composing the framework. Now, like a chess game, all these salient traits of human thinking are to be understood only when intelligence and beliefs are seen in their biological setting, in the behavior of living beings adjusting themselves to their environment and manipulating its materials, and in their social setting, functioning in specific ways in a cultural whole. Remember the geist, the spirit, our ability to think, the abstract reasoning, everything is grounded in biological setting. Our desire to explain, to understand, to comprehend is itself a natural biological disposition. Okay? Yes, this is of course, this is a pivotal point. Knowledge is a natural fact, hence naturalism. What does it mean? Like, for instance, that knowledge itself is subject to evolution. It evolves. What does it mean, it evolves? Here, the game becomes dangerous. Science is not just a theoretical attitude, it's a behavior. It's a behavior, it's a set of intersubjective standards, is a way of behave. Over the long time of history, the best scientific practices, behaviors, standards, ethical commitments have been selected. Okay, here, of course, you can, there is a flaw in the argument, no? Descriptive versus normative. No? On the one way, I just describe an evolutionary process. On the other way, it must do like this. Okay, and so nowadays, our empirical, my goodness, the reference is today, best scientific practices are the best. They are fitted to understand the world, social relation, organization, economics, and so on. Okay, there is the gist of the argument. Yes, it is as, coming back to Randall Jr., the intelligibility of natural world, it is as though the natural world demanded to be understood in a certain way. There are sort of Galilean tones, the book of nature written in mathematical characters. So following its own affordances, we do understand nature. And when the form of scientific understanding aligns with the mode of being of nature, we have a coincidence of form and content. Our representation becomes one and the same thing with events, processes, natural events, okay? This is the core, no? We were speaking with Dionysius of the myth of the given, denounced by Sellars. It is as though nature, in naturalism, come to reveal its nomological structure, okay? Okay, so back to Woodbridge, back to history, back to the work of historians. Now, when we do history, we do representation of the past, organized representation of the past, as if the past follows some specific path. How do historians operate? This is also in a way, cool argumentative move, historians adopt filters, adopt selected filters, and they cannot but, okay? Conceptual tools, lexical, they have interest. They decide now what to analyze in the past. Selected principles become, because in a sense, they give form to history. The use of the word form is by no means accidental. They give forms because there are structures spread everywhere, which have a counterpart in the organization of things. Now we have to develop this specific part of the argument. Here, the reference is to Aristotle. Woodbridge makes the example of a grain of wheat, so which has its own disposition, potentialities, and if we do not have external impediments, in a way develops, okay, its inner disposition. But in the case of a grain of wheat, we have empirical sciences that can inform us about the inner structure of it, describing its chemical structure and so on. But we have also just temporal structures, like in the case of institutions, in which their structure coincides with their history. So in the case of organic spatial structures, their organization or their form is revealed by science. But what does happen in the case of temporal social institution, which is in the world of human affairs? How is revealed in this case the structure? Yes, the structure in this case is revealed by selective principle adopted by historians. Bear in mind that historian, we are now at the beginning of the 20th century, she never works alone, but they are part of a scientific community which adopt the best scientific practices that have evolved. So it is the scientific community who dictates, who suggests the adoption of the right conceptual filters to investigate the past, okay? So here the great question, how the reference to forms operate in the case of events and of human institution. Here, long story short, the selective principles through which we, or the community of historians, organize history are themselves grounded in re. That's checkmate, so to say. Okay, so historians do not adopt arbitrarily selective principle, but the scientific community, okay, which is part of the great evolution of science, okay, provide them with the right tool, which are not coming from the mind or from the heavens, but are grounded in, has a counterpart, okay, in the world of natural processes. All right, now to just let us understand it, Woodbridge makes himself a case study. He takes on the concept of progress. Okay, so for instance, from the French Enlightenment on, the concept of progress has been huge, has been widely adopted. Okay, so from a certain point on, such a concept entered into the manifest image of we humans, of how we humans describe ourselves, our history in the world. Okay, why then? The question Woodbridge poses himself this question: why the concept of progress had gained such a momentum, was so successful Well, for instance, because it aligns with the image, with a certain image of time, which unfolds progressively. It intersects with such an idea of cumulative development. Okay, remember the idea of evolution of knowledge. Okay, it resonates, of course, with the idea of evolution. So these are all factors that makes the concept of progress palatable, so to say. Okay, acceptable. But there is something more, no? Woodbridge says progress is thus characteristic of human history because it's characteristic of man that progress should be conceived. So once again, why do the human beings at a certain point of their evolution, natural evolution and cultural evolution do overlap? Why do human beings at a certain point of their evolution did create, in a sense, this concept of progress? Where it came from? Okay. And here, Woodbridge mixed up such three references, Kant, Aristotle, and Darwin, combining them. We have Kant. There is no progress in things. Of course, we cannot know it, but we cannot help but organizing history, adopting progress. Transcendental line, realistic line. There are forms in nature. There are principles of organization everywhere. There are forms everywhere that tends toward their realization. Remember, this Aristotelian stance was mediated, for instance, by Leibniz in the modern world. Now, the very word organism was a neologist created by Leibniz. We don't have organism. Now, in the classical Greek language, we have organicon, organ, but not organism. Organism is a modern word, Middle Age modern, in the sense that it designates a machine which is designed by a planner. Okay, a machine that it's always machine in its smallest part, a machine that tends to perform, to display its own activity, vis activa primitiva, Leibniz, energia, came in on this late scholasticism, Aristotelian lexicon again. So the Aristotelian way, there are everywhere forms, principle, organization. The Darwinian way, we don't have a plan, but there is a lawfulness in biological principles that govern the pattern of evolution. We do have a nomological structure. Okay, so Woodbridge combined these three positions together, and the result is the concept of progress, in its primary way, designates a relational, transformative dynamic rooted in human nature and its biological functioning. More precisely, I find extremely interesting this part of Woodbridge. The outcome is, it is part of the biological functioning of human beings to produce organized performances and to recognize themselves reflexively as historical subjects, as the authors of such performances. This designates the word progress. Now, a biological functioning to produce organized patterns of behaviors, okay, and to reflexively, human beings recognize themselves as the author of such organized performances. So we conceive progress because, in a sense, it's our own nature, okay, that imposes us to conceive it. Man makes progress because he can conceive what progress is. and use that conception as a standard of selection as a goal to be reached. He participates in his own history consciously. And that means that he participates in it morally with a sense of obligation to his career. Now, I go toward the conclusion. Once we have unpacked the category of progress, we have to face a lot of consequences. For instance, now that the category of progress is acceptable, palatable, scientifically justified, we can distinguish between material progress, criteria of economy, efficiency, so mastering, instrumental aspects that enhance existence, from rational progress. What is rational progress? A couple of things. On one side, scientific knowledge that evolves. So the very system of knowledge that evolves, is a sort of cumulative enterprise, intersubjective, cumulative enterprise. But more than this, the cultural anthropologists come into the field. There are now, back in the days, we are in the 20s, the 40s, the anthropologists started to speak about cultural relativity in the sense that the very notion of culture is a relational concept. And so comparing different cultures, we can appreciate that there are some ethical values shared across cultures. In the sense that every social group, that there are examples now, the incest taboo, the care and protection of offspring, condemnation of intergroup homicide, fidelity to agreements, burial rights, anthropological sciences here come into the field. So there are some natural values. So we are allowed, in a sense, to speak not only of material progress, but of a rational progress. Once again, for your benefit, I make the long story short. The idea under this cultural anthropological point of view is that we have different cultures with different level of organization, different system of values, even if there are some intercross values. But again, in the long time of history, every culture will develop according to the principle of a scientific rationality. Because scientific knowledge is the outcome, is the highest outcome of the evolutionary process. So in the long run, all different cultures will tend to assimilate each other. Couple of quotations. So the rational form of society, man that begins to conceive ideal law, friendship, and ideal society, blah, blah, blah. We can skip it. Man can consider occupation more satisfied than no happiness, blah, blah, blah. In entering upon it, he makes rational progress. Its measure is the degree of success. He attains is making his animal life minister to ideals he can own without reserve and law without regret. You remember where we started? No plan, no purpose, no supernatural entities, And here we come to acknowledge the form of an ideal, rational society, which is grounded, this is the final form. There is a form of rational progress that constitutes the end of history when considered from within human communities. So the strategy is to, on the one side, third perspective or first perspective. So considering history from the outside, but we cannot do it because we are part of it. So considering it from within, we have to finally acknowledge that there is a purpose. There are some ends. There is a direction, Human history is something more than the lives of great men the rise and fall of states, the growth of institutions, customs, the vagaries of religion, philosophy. It is also a rational enterprise. Expressed in naturalistic terms, it is history conscious of what history is. So in the naturalized history, we human beings for the first time become really conscious of what we have done, of who we are, okay? And then freedom, of course, because the topic of rational progress is intertwined with the concept of freedom. What does it mean, freedom? Freedom for the naturalist didn't have a juridical meaning, first of all, or but an epistemic one. Freedom, first of all, means emancipating from false beliefs. Just for our fun, semi-quotation, scientific empirical knowledge will make you free. Remember, the driving of secularization in the USA of the 19th century was low, naturalism was a movement of emancipation, of liberation from dogma, from religion, from false beliefs. So, okay, this is why naturalism brings in itself a meaning of freedom, of being free, theoretically free. I cannot accept false beliefs in the name of science, okay? And that's why such methodological, naturalized practices of reserve, they do have emancipatory force. Because science is not just a theoretical attitude, but a behavior. Okay, it has ethical implication. So we come now to a big point in the sense that naturalism itself embodied, according to this narrative, the very freedom it aimed to describe. If you want to be free, you have to be naturalist. We cannot but be naturalist to achieve a human freedom, just a human freedom. Remember, the naturalism at its beginning was a form of humanism. It was a religion. It was the true religion based on scientific knowledge. Okay, so the good Christian of the future will be a naturalist. The atheist will be the good Christian of the future. It was a battle of religion. It has always been a battle of religion. Okay? When we speak of naturalism, first of all, we are speaking not just of a set of contents, but of a methodological principle. This has a universal value. And this, the rhetoric goes on. When we come to knowledge, we have no alternative. Okay? Remember, we are in the 20s, in the 30s, the peak of the ideology. And so here comes democracy, of course, because if naturalism, this is Sidney Hook, 1944, Naturalism in a Spirit, the paper is Democracy, Naturalism and Democracy. If naturalism and scientific empiricism, we can change, okay, it's the same, be generic terms for the philosophic attitude, which submit all claims of fact and value to test by experience, then scientific empiricism as a philosophy is more congenial to a democratic than to an anti-democratic community. For it brings into the open light of criticism, discussion, the interest in which moral values and social institutions are rooted. Empiricism, so conceived, is commitment to a procedure, not to a theory of metaphysics. Okay. This is the final link between naturalism and democracy. So I really come to conclusion. The procedures adopted by scientific communities represent a long-term history that over the centuries has selected the most reliable result practices. This process has produced normative frameworks that have become behavioral standard. But what does it mean, this reference to procedure? It means that something is rational when it is discussed in the open space. No, it's the open space of justification. And so the idea is that only a democratic society can be enough strong to support this game of exchanging reason, giving reason, supporting justification, being criticized. Okay? And consider this osmotic passage. In a sense, naturalism is the antechamber of democracies. Why then? Because the scientific method requires no difference in gender, in opinions. Everybody can participate in it. Everybody can participate in the game, in the great game of science, of knowledge. It's a paritarian game, okay? So in a sense, the virtue of the naturalist discourse are exported as the reasons of a democratic society, okay? And here, we were speaking together yesterday, democracy as a way of life. So not just an institution, so a way of life differs from its alternative in that it makes possible the extension of this method of reaching reasonable conclusion from the field of professional science and philosophy to all areas of human experience in which genuine problems arise. We are in 1944, and here naturalism becomes something more, becomes a political justification of democracy as a scientific evolutionary outcome. Okay? 1947, we must recognize we are already into the Cold War, that the free thought and scientific method which liberalism cherished make it possible to revise the liberal creed in its own term, just as a flexible democratic constitution provides for its own amendment, and thus diminishes the need or the danger of revolution. The idea is of an ongoing process of self-justification. So democracy is incapable of negotiating again its own principle. And this is the very last slide. So coming to the 40s, coming to the onset of the Cold War, we have this sort of result. The naturalized civilization is the form, in the strongest possible sense, of the present. It is the form of history, okay? Because it gives access to the true human-only human meaning of history, because it speaks in the name of science. So we have no such rhetorical device. Freedom, knowledge, democracy are rooted in the very nature of things. Okay, and here, of course, we were naturalism bended to an ideological tool, of course, which was widely used also in the diplomatic spheres on, but this is another history. I thank you for your attention. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Antonio, for this great talk, very informative talk, and I guess it shows us the tremendous difference between the debates around naturalism in America in the first half of the 20th century, as opposed to the debates about naturalism in the second half of the 20th century, which were far more technical and devoid of political or ethical bite or consequences. Okay, so does anyone want to ask something from those who are connected via Zoom? Or
Το chat φαίνεται να έχει δύο.
okay. So okay.
Yes,
Is
I would like to. I would like to ask a question. Well, first, thank you so much for the fascinating lecture. I enjoyed it very, very much and learned a lot. Okay, so at some point, you said that everything is grounded in natural processes, which means that everything is a natural process. So I felt there is a shift there between everything grounded in natural processes, in naturalism, and everything being naturalistic. To me, this is not necessarily the case. Actually, it could be a dangerous jump because a mental state having correlations in natural processes doesn't mean that it is caused by natural processes. And if all cultural development relates to mental states and mental activities, I fear that a reduction of the mental to the natural might be philosophically quite controversial, if not impossible, if we take seriously the hard problem of consciousness. So I mean, in terms of a critical assessment of this narrative, I wonder how they would ask the contemporary challenges stemming from the study of consciousness and non-reductionism.
Okay.
Sorry?
Okay, can I thank you very much. I do agree. We are considering here the early naturalist debate, and in a sense, such guys set the agenda for the future discussion. And precisely this topic, now, the difference you pointed out now between being grounded and having relation. For instance, I was referencing to Wilfried Sellars. That was a point of major criticism, not the myth of the given. So here, the general idea is how we can make history as a science. Because you correctly pointed out about the question of mind, but let's zoom about collective, multiple, society, community, history of society, cultural history. And here, I think that also today, this topic of cultural evolution, cultural natural evolution, adopting biological principle, coming to the 80s, it has its point of resistance because it's far more tricky when we refer to something such larger like intersubjective standards, intersubjective social situated standard. Remember Dilthey, the rationale of the distinction between Naturwissenschaften and Geisteswissenschaften, different models of science. But both science, no hierarchy. If you want to know how a specific culture developed, you cannot, but do history. In a sense, accepting contingency. And naturalists had a sort of problem with this topic of contingency because they consider philosophy, in a sense, as a nomothetic science, not as an ideographic science. Okay, so the first item that was naturalized, that was philosophy itself, the grounding of the journal of philosophy in the heading, it was written creating a scientific philosophy. That was a sort of manner. Of course, we are here, back in the days, we are referring to a restrict concept of science, which is different from nowadays, that's for sure. Okay, so here, back in the days, the science meant physics, chemistry, biology, more or less. And the social sciences were somehow difficult to insert in this topic. So no, I do agree. I would say just that here we are referring to the initial phase of a long term debate.
So, there's a question from Professor.
Thank you. It was a very thought-provoking talk, very many things that I want to ask about, but I'll choose one. So I guess I'm worried that there might be two separate notions of an end of history. And for some of them, the premises that you cite the naturalists as giving seem very reasonable, and for others of them, they seem suspect. So a more robust notion of an end of history is one that involves, when we say something has an end, that involves it having a creator, or that may involve what you said at the beginning of the talk, everything marching towards that, deterministically, so to speak. An entirely different notion of an end of something is just that there's normativity in it, that there's better and worse ways for it to be, right? So in the transcendental premise that you gave, when we say, I can't but imagine history as having an end, it seems to me entirely reasonable to imagine history as not having a creator, and entirely reasonable to imagine history as not trending towards some state of affairs deterministically, even. So that transcendental premise looks false, given the Aristotelian stronger notion of end. On the other hand, it seems entirely true to me to say that I can't but represent the world in a value-laden way, in a way that has worse things and better things. But so where the American naturalists worried about in their naturalism eliminating the more robust notion of an end of history, or the more the less robust one? In other words, were they worried about ends in the way we usually think of them, or were they worried just about maintaining a certain type of ethical normativity?
It's a super question. I don't have, I can work together with you. We are facing a number of problems here. One that relate us to the very beginning of modern philosophy, of natural philosophy in Descartes or in Leibnizian sense. No? For Descartes, there are basically no living substances. Everything is mechanical. We humans are the only living creatures because we have the soul, but we are an exception because we are created directly by God for his own glory. Leibniz didn't agree. And that's why there is this topic about the organism. Not just humans are livings, also animals, also plants. He brought into the table the topic of organization. Organism means machine in a modern sense. Natura is orlogi Dei, is the clockwork of God. This is a huge problem because the very concept of machine need a designer, a planner. It doesn't make sense without, okay? So this is a strong heritage because for us, modern nature is the true mechanical model, is the true machine, okay? And that's why also now Kant uses this device, this is a super smart move, because I don't want this topic of a designer. I want to understand it properly. Okay, this is on the transcendental move. But then we're dealing with Darwin, and the whole plot changes, of course. But all in all, in our hands, so to say, we have still a mechanical device, which calls for a designer but there is no designer. We don't want it anymore, especially in that USA society where religions were widespread everywhere. And so we don't want it anymore. We would like to have an intentionless normativity. That's the point, which is a highly contradictory concept set in modern terms. Okay, because in modern terms, finality is bound to intentionality. Okay, Descartes paved the way for this. Okay, also Ancion, as you remember, in Organism Freiheit, that's why this Aristotelian flavor came into the vogue again, because no, we can have a model of intentionless normativity referring to the natural world, so of organization that are, in a sense, autonomous, efficient, no, but without a general plan. I know that I'm not answering, I'm just giving you it's helping more context. What strikes me is that naturalists, they neglected the topic of history in an unbelievable way, also today, I dare say. And so when we refer to such texts, there are not very much of them, we find such striking contrast between a teleology, a strong presence of teleology, and it shouldn't be. It shouldn't supposed to be. Then we also find these political texts, and we somehow have to put an hand in history, otherwise, no, our community would refer to other philosophy of histories. Philosophy of history was neglected in the USA, then it was explicitly prohibited by the McCarthy age, of course, during the Cold War. Professor couldn't speak of such topics. It came over the 70s, the 80s, much later. And so also nowadays, as Dionysius was telling us, when we are entering the naturalist debate, we almost never find reference to history. So what does it mean? In which sense it is a science? No? I like those texts because we find a lot of stuff, all mixed up together. You're right, there are different levels of finality, purposiveness, and so on. Now, so Woodbridge takes on Aristotle, Darwin, Kant, mixing them up, okay, just to justify basic, because a community doesn't stand just by science. It needs something, a cohesive factor. That was their original inspiration. We need something more, especially in a cultural fragmented society, as in the USA, of course. So up to date, there is no shared memory about Civil War, for instance. So this idea of now history, which is oriented toward freedom, was the perfect solution. Then bear in mind that during the 20s, social scientists, psychologists, they all pointed out that it was plenty of flaws. The argument had a lot of flaws, but then came the 30s, then came the 40s. And naturally, it was the major cultural movement, and from a descriptive tone, assume a highly normative tone. So democracy is not just an history outcome, but does represent history, human history as it must be, as a standard. Sorry for the point.
No, yeah. So, yeah.
Thank you very much for your talk. It was very interesting. So I just want to ask two questions, one more specific and one more general. The more general is about the impression your talk gave me, and I don't know whether it was intentional or not. First of all, it was like the way you presented it was like moving away gradually from Darwin and what we know from evolution. So the term evolution in the process changed its meaning basically. At least it was not the Darwinian evolution, it was something different. And it sounded more and more like a potpourri of ideas and theories from philosophy put together to justify.
Yeah.
At least I saw a
Yeah.
irony in the way you presented. So I don't know whether I interpreted it well. So on the one hand, it looked like you started from a kind of grounding effort to ground history and Darwinism and this sense of nature. And so it moved far away from that towards kind of normativity. And also that was kind of moving away from, I don't know, science or philosophy or argument to rhetoric and ideology. So in the end, what you want to say, I think, is nature. The meaning of the word nature sounded more like a justification, a pretext for justifying ideology, nice ideology. I mean, I don't.
Also.
But they lost a sense of kind of scientific background. I don't know. I felt towards the end that we didn't mean about the same thing, even when we speak about naturalism. I was not sure. So that's a kind of general impression. So I wanted to ask whether this is your intention. And the second, because from what I know, very generally, Darwinism is all about chance. No purpose. There's no human purpose. There is no spiritual purpose, no individual purpose. Also, there is no learning. All this history, all this progress in knowledge is more about learning. I mean, traditional, I don't know how selection can. So this one, and the more specific question is about the notion of law.
Oh, sorry?
The notion of law or law of nature, was there from the beginning, or was it conceived as somehow problematic in the context of evolution theory? How?
You mean a scientific law?
Yeah, the laws, scientific laws. Was there compatible? Was it there from the start in this American approach of scientific history? Did they give significance in the notion of law of history and law of nature? Too much.
No, yeah, thank you so much. No, it's like this. First of all, Darwin, yes, you're right. The point it is that for sake of brevity, I didn't mention Spencer. Because Darwin, the principle of man, he never gave an account about the relation of principle of evolution and human society, which was the point of Spencer. So at the very beginning in the USA naturalism, well, in a sense, there was more Spencer than Darwin. Then Spencer was rejected by James, for instance, by Dewey, but they faced a problem that Darwin left unsolved. How are we to apply principle of evolution to society? And how can I say, I was speaking about the momentum of positivism, neopositivism, the great promise was to explain. And the philosophical stone was the laws of society. Because first we discovered the laws of nature, classical physics, mechanics, and then we come to human societies. This is the philosophical stone. But Darwin didn't have a word on this. It is not totally, I do not totally agree about this topic. Clearly, there is no plan on no ends in Darwin, but there is organization. So it's not correct to say that evolution comes randomly. Okay, once first combination are on the table, then there is a rule, then there is a norm. So that's an important thing. In the long run, yes, of course, you don't have any plan. The evolution doesn't apply the word meaning, okay? But physical processes are organized, and biological processes display high level of organization. That's the tricky point, of course. Okay. Concerning law, I would come back to the distinction of nomothetic versus ideographic science. Here, the point of naturalism is to treat philosophy as a nomothetic science. repudiating its ideographic aspect, no? Cioè, the Einleitung in the Geisteswissenschaften of Dilthey, and then Windelband, and then Rilke, the whole movement of the German historicism had its own rationale for defending the normative autonomy of human sciences. That was the idea. And this is on the table. Are human sciences, history, for instance, are they endowed with an autonomous normativity or not? Or natural sciences non-technically can explain the laws of economics, of social processes, demography. So, okay, so there was really an epistemic tension concerning the very notion of science, of course. Yeah, but you're right. Of course, following the debates, coming the 20s, coming the 30s, the debate becomes more and more ideological, of course, because you could count the number of democracy using the finger of one hand. And so now this topic of scientific method that presupposes an open space to be discussed and so on became the cornerstone for self-justification. Also with a sense of rivalry, if you want, with old Europe, which fall prey of ideologies. There was a sense, we shouldn't have to neglect this intellectual trajectory, okay? Because back in the days, there was a sense of, how can I say, like cultural European heritage and so on. And now coming the 30s, coming the 40s, situation reversed, okay? And so naturally became synonymous in a rhetorical way of democracy, of freedom, despite Europe, that there was, in effect, an ideological struggle, which in Europe we didn't tend to recognize, but kind of late.
Kostas?
Thanks for the talk. It's very interesting. I have two related questions. You insisted that what you're saying about naturalism is something having to do with methodology.
Same.
But in my ears, it seems that you also presented a thesis where you talk about the first person and the third person as being combined in a way.
Okay.
And to me, this sounds a very interesting claim, actually. It's like it's a way for them to differentiate themselves from the positions, the classical, the distinction that you mentioned. And in order for them to do that, they need to advance a thesis, something to like a clear statement. Otherwise, if it's just methodology, then one could say, why you...
Absolutely.
Yeah. And what maybe we can learn something from this and let's say philosophize this natural move for our own philosophical purposes. Because there is also a debate about consciousness. I want to focus on the last point you made about the first person and the third person. And there is this problem of how to reconcile these two perspectives, right? But what you presented is a way to do, to reconcile this. So what if we can learn from this reconciliation? And this.
Thank you. No, you're absolutely right. This is something that I didn't mention, but now we can mention it. Up to a certain point came a great divide among naturalists themselves. there were two major tendencies. What nowadays we call a methodological naturalism, championed by Dewey, for instance, or all these guys of the Columbia, okay? And then the ontological naturalism, which was far more different and strict, championed, for instance, by Roy Wood Sellars, who disagreed. Basically, his idea is that a naturalist, to be consequent, has to embrace an ontology, a physicalist ontology. And so in this case, we are speaking of physical realism, also in the sense of starting from what physics tells us about structure of matter and so on, and from there to analyze, explain, hopefully, the problem of consciousness and so on. So there was a great tension about the very concept of materialism. What does it? Naturalism is a form of materialism or not? That was the point. So for Dewey and his school, the anthropological school, they say, no, it is not a form of materialism because human culture is something more. Because if you embrace too tighten a form of materialism, then you have problem with this broad topic of cultural processes, history, cultural development, how we can treat culture. And then you can adopt an emergent stance and so on, who adopted Kroeber. But okay, we have a sort of problem. On the other side, Roy Bruxellas, all the ontologists had its own right. The funny thing is that both tendencies had great success. So the ontological one, which paved the way for the if you want, also the neurological account of everything, okay? And also the methodological one, which is more, how can I say, not subtle, but adaptable. So you can accept everything but a couple of principles, okay? My own position is to treat naturalism itself as historical movement, position, to situate it, not as a universal category of philosophy, but as a philosophical, cultural movement shaped in the US society, in the international, let's say, world order of the first decades of the 20th century, as a long, enormous event, if you want, but an historical event, trying to avoid its rhetoric, because this is the point. Up to a certain point, the master argument is, what is the alternative? What is the alternative? Irrationalism, fideism, totalitarianism. And so you are, in a sense, compelled to say, no, okay, this is, I cannot but do this. Okay, which of course, under a logical point of view, doesn't make sense, but it works. And history is not made by logic.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Don't know what to say, many things. Figure my mind.
Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. That was very rewarding.
Thank you.
Thanks. Now, I want to focus on a gray area in the shift. I mean, there's the Aristotelian idea where there's progress everywhere, in as much as every process leads one closer to a telos. So closer one to a telos, we can say that we progress. And there's also the Darwinian, and there's also the Kantian, which is unconmeasurable. It's kind of. But once the organism, the organisms enters the discussion, and even within the Leibnizian
Yes.
And where not only humans are organisms.
Yes.
There's a huge gray area on the non-organic part of nature.
Yes.
So once scientists or philosophers apprehend of this function, they can, of course, describe it and conceptualize it, but do they also project it into nature itself? So if the framework is not pantheistic, so the whole universe is an organism, then what about this gray area in the world?
It's tough question. Dunque, usually after a couple of weeks, the answer comes to my mind. So, no, really, I'm really disappointed in the live discussion because but for instance, Leibniz did a nice example. I was telling Dionysus yesterday, the pond of fish, the lake of fish, focus on this organic versus non-organic. So the pond of fish is plenty of fishes, but it's not alive. This was his way. So you have principle of organization, of vitality everywhere. But that doesn't mean being a living system. You need something more. So you have fishes in the lake, but the lake is not living. This was his device.
Engineers, like all this.
Yes, of course. And so he was able to differentiate the levels. So we can refer to just the mechanical level, and this is the level of the efficient causes. And we have to stick to efficient causes, machine. Then, but this is not enough. If we want a real comprehension, we have to consider another level, which is the level of the forms. Forms for Leibniz are, in the simplest way, codes of information, sort of metaphysical codes. No? Here comes finality. Here I use the lexicon of forms of finality. What I am not supposed to do is to mix up the two different levels. This is a prohibited move. So you either give a finalistic explanation or a mechanical one. Such a nice distinction is lost by naturalists. And so the great problem is that now, let's stick to empirical sciences, let's stick to anthropologies. Human communities have the sense of finality. How mechanically, in a sense, we explain, nomothetically, we explain this sense of finality. Because we don't want Kant anymore. Kant had its own solution and it worked. But it worked provided of not having a strong ontological assumption, of course. In a sense, reducing science to epistemology.
Yes, this worked.
But it worked, yes, of course.
The century.
Aristotle is the solution.
Sorry?
Aristotle is the...
But it's really nice that both Woodbridge and Randall Jr. were not only Aristotelian, but early, the early reception of Aristotle in the 16th, 17th century. So they were well aware of this Leibnizian tools, this way of combining the lexicon of forms with the lexicon of mechanics. And that's why I have selected Woodbridge and Randall Jr., because in a sense they use a lot of resources for treating such a neglected topic as history was, basically. And then, yes, I was referring also to this neo-Aristotelianism of Ansionas, for instance, because it dealt with, in a way, with the same problem. No, it speaking of not just organization in nature, but you're acquainted with this Jonas ontology. The matter has consciousness, basically. So yes, in a sort of yes, in the sort of direction. Yes. upsiding the paradigm. So we put consciousness inside matter, let's say, as our friend Galen throws on probably defense.
Okay. So let me just 1 minute. We don't have time. 2 or 3 observations. Maybe you can discuss it later. I was reminded of the fact that when you said that evolution, there are natural laws in evolution, not these guys hold this position. And nowadays, many people think that evolutionary laws are not strict laws, but they're more like historical laws. I mean, to understand a phenomenon evolutionarily, you have to know its past, how it formed from its past generation. The kind of historical law, not in the sense of human history. You also have this problem there: natural history versus cultural history, and you have to find the connections again. But okay, some people say that evolutionary laws are historical laws. No. But this is compatible, I think, with our framework. The next thing that I was reminded of was, let's say there are many human practices that are nearly all, in a sense, they're Darwinian adaptations to the environment. We have science, we have ethics, we have politics. All these practices are, in a sense, adapted or selected, more or less, as not successful, but you know what I mean. Adaptable. But we have the problem that they're not synthesized together. So you can't derive strict ethical laws or how society is to be organized from science alone. So there's a problem of coordination between practices, human practices, although all of these practices are Darwinianly adapted in a sense. So it seems that the notion of Darwinian adaptations is wider than the notion we would like to have in order to derive, ethical or political principles from it. But I was thinking maybe their conception of democracy can provide the missing link. I'm not sure, because democracy, okay, it's difficult to say that it's justified Darwinianly, of course. But I was wondering, now this thought came to me during your talk, that they might say that there is the political organization, there is the most adequate political organization, not to tell us, not in the sense that it tells us what is the content of the general welfare, but in the sense that it is the best political tool we have in order to experiment on what this collective welfare is, although what we might be wrong about it. Because democracy, like science, is self-correcting or it has all these tools that prohibit it from being, authoritarian or tyrannical or like that. But I don't know if maybe what I say now fits their framework or not. I don't know what would you say about that.
Ok, allora, just first of all, the notion of law, yes, of course, we have entered into a sort of deflationary attitude, from a certain point on, let's say, Van Frass and so on, the very notion of law came into a sort of crisis because it's too strong, it's too demanding. So from strictly epistemic point of view, there was much going on about the very discussion of law. It's better model than law. We have models now, so you are absolutely right. Now, starting from the 80s, we still more of models and to laws in the sense of this early naturalist. The point of the human practices adapted to environment. Yeah, this is a point I'd like to stress. The relation between pluralism, liberal naturalism, so its commitment to pluralism. Is it really? Or there is still a sort of methodological monism? And I don't know. And I don't know either. I don't know. When I speak of methodological monism, I refer to procedures. Now the topic of procedures. Remember now also Sidney Hughes spoke about not so much of method, but procedure. Procedure means the tool we all use in our activity. Otherwise, you are out of the game in this sense. No? We use the same syllabus for every major. We have the same. No? If you want to submit a journal to paper, the peer review process. So we come into a social epistemology, which gained its momentum from the 80s, so the sociological dimension of knowledge, because back in the days there was this idea of public knowledge. Knowledge is public in this sense, as its own history, evolve, and requires, in a sense, an open space to be debated, to accept the contradiction, so on. Is it like this today? Yeah. This concept of public knowledge, how is the status of health today of this topic of public knowledge? For instance, there was a bias by naturalists on this idea that knowledge is a natural resource of human beings, not a private property, not manipulating by private owners, no modeling AI system beyond. And so now it's a topic of how do scientific practices actually work. And that was also one point that I'd like to stress, that this larger project of naturalism was a social project, not just theoretical. Social project that was, in a sense, situated with a certain idea of democracy, society, Western identity, and so on. It's a situated knowledge, to quote Donna Haraway. So it's not just an answer, just to debate together with you.
Even more interested all these interests of the Americans in the beginning of the 20th, American philosophers, beginning of the 20th century, combined to these views. Okay, I think we are out of time. Yeah, it's 5 to 7, so we can.
You're the organizer.
Okay, I'm the organizer. So we thank Antonio for his talk.
Thank you.
And we'll be back again next month, okay, with our next talk, I think it's by me, about reasons and causes, or reason and nature again, and how they might both be ways of being processes at the ontological level. Okay, I'm not sure if I present that, but that's the plan for now. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
I'm recording.